pay your tithe of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. But you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Our denomination's founder, John Wesley, strongly encouraged his followers to participate in the political realm. According to his entry in a 1774 journal, he urged Methodist Society members to vote without fee or reward for the person they judged most worthy, to speak no evil of the person they voted against, and to take care their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side. How far we've fallen away from these ideas in this 21st century. Now, not every society member could follow his advice, because in Wesley's day, voting was strictly a land-owning male affair, getting to the point where all adult citizens had a choice in choosing their government took hard work, great risk, and tremendous faith. This morning I'll briefly mention 3 Wesleyan women who helped form this more perfect union, even as they, as Wesley admonished, were moving on to Christian perfection. As I mentioned, the 19th Amendment followed more than 70 years of persistence through setbacks and sacrifices. And the people called Methodists were part of the struggle from the very beginning. So it should be no surprise that the first women's right convention at Seneca Falls in New York was hosted in a Wesleyan chapel. Historians typically identify this 1848 gathering as the start of the organized women's suffrage movement. Back then, advocates for women's rights and the abolition of slavery were closely entwined. For example, I'm sure you've heard of Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave born in 1797 as Isabella Baumfree in rural New York. By the time she was 9, she was sold away from her parents. And by the time she escaped in 1827, she had endured 5 owners, several beatings, and separation from her children. But then, as a free woman, she joined the Methodist Church and became an itinerant Methodist preacher and took the name Sojourner Truth. She preached mightily for her Lord and the disempowered, advocating strongly for freedom for slaves, fairness for the poor, and the right of votes for women. She also helped persuade abolitionist Frederick Douglass against violent revolt to try to free the slaves, urging him instead to place his faith in God. She reportedly said, "Frederick, is God dead?" And he responded, "No." But after the Civil War, opponents to change tried to draw a dividing line between the activists, and this was accomplished in 1870, when African American men were given the right to vote, but even that soon proved quite weak in the face of so many states' Jim Crow laws. Now today, it seems hard to believe that there was a time when American women were not able to participate fully in democracy. This past Wednesday was the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement's victory. Now the word suffrage comes from the Latin word suffragia, and it means voting tally. But as you can imagine, opponents were happy to play on its similarity to an English word, because with women's suffrage, those critics argued that men and families would suffer. So beginning in the mid-19th century, several generations of women supporters lectured, wrote, marched, lobbied, and practiced civil obedience to achieve what many Americans felt was a radical change to the Constitution. And few supporters lived to see final victory on August 26, 1920. One who did not live to see the 19th Amendment's ratification was the women's rights activist Reverend Anna Howard Shaw. Shaw was one of the first women ordained in the Methodist Church. And she was able to serve as a bridge between the Seneca Falls generation and the younger suffragists who would go on to advocate for equal rights in all aspects of American life. Anna was born in England in 1847, and when she was 4, her family emigrated to the United States and settled in Massachusetts. When Anna was 12, she writes, "My father took up claim of 365 acres of land in the wilderness of northern Michigan and sent Mother and her 5 young children to live there alone." Now her mom envisioned the Michigan home to be an English farm with flowing meadows and sunny skies filled with daisies. But she was devastated upon arrival to discover that it was actually a forlorn and desolate log cabin in what was then the wilderness of Michigan, 40 miles from a post office and 100 miles from a railroad. So the family faced extreme dangers of living on the frontier, and Shaw took upon herself several physical tasks, such as digging of a well, chopping wood for the fireplace, and felling trees. And the family's misfortunes only grew worse over the years. During the Civil War, her sister Eleanor gave birth but died doing so. And her brother Tom was severely wounded. So when Shaw was only 15, she became a school teacher, using her earnings to support her family. Yet, with every month's effort, the gulf between income and expenses grew wider. Now, Anna felt a call to preach from an early age, and she'd spend a lot of times in the woods near her home, standing on tree stumps to preach to the forest. She was determined to go to college and follow the path that she felt God's will was for her life. Despite her family's disapproval after the Civil War, she abandoned her teaching job and moved in with her married sister Mary, where she recalls that she would have preferred more physical and active labor, such as digging ditches or shoveling coal, but was forced to pick up what she called the dreaded needle and became a seamstress. A pivotal moment in Shaw's life came when she met a Reverend Mariana Thompson, a Universalist minister who came to preach in Grand Rapids. And she went to the service eagerly to see a woman in the pulpit. And at the age of 24, Shaw herself was invited to preach her first sermon. But she hesitated because her only experience had been as a little girl preaching alone in the forest to a congregation of listening trees. Despite the success of her first sermon and her passion to preach, she received strong disapproval from her family, who agreed to pay for her college education only if she would abandon preaching. But despite such continual opposition and isolation, Anna refused. And in 1873, the Methodist Church voted unanimously to grant her a local preacher's license. So Shaw entered college, a Methodist one in Michigan, and she supported herself as that licensed preacher, giving lectures on temperance. Upon graduation, she attended Boston University's School of Theology. But she was the only woman in a class of 42 men, and she felt the abysmal conviction that I was not really wanted there. And after having run on a tight income, Shaw found that the male licensed preachers were given other treatments. They were given free accommodations in the dormitory, and their board cost each of them $1.25, while it cost her $2 to pay for a room outside. So after she lost money to pay that rent, she started to question if the ministerial profession was meant for her. But in the face of all these hardships, Shaw continued. And in 1880, after passing the exam with the top score of that year, she was ordained in the Methodist Church. But then following her ordination, Anna also received her MD from Boston University. And during her time in medical school, she became an advocate of political rights for women. And that's when Shaw first met Susan B. Anthony, who encouraged her to join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. And beginning in 1904, for the next 11 years, Anna was the president of NAWSA. And then, during World War I, Reverend Shaw was head of the Women's Committee of the United States Council on National Defense and became the first woman to earn the Distinguished Service Medal. But she continued to fight for the suffrage cause for the remainder of her life. At an appearance months before her death at Baylor University, she said, "The only way to refute the argument that America was a democracy and therefore women were entitled to vote was to prove that women are not people. Shaw died of pneumonia at her home in Moylan, Pennsylvania, at the age of 72, just a few months before Congress ratified the 19th Amendment. She built a home on 240 Ridley Creek Road in Media while president of NARSA. And she lived there with her companion, Lucy Elmina Anthony, a niece of Susan B. Anthony, until her death. They lived together for 30 years, and she was beside her when she died. The Anna Howard Shaw Center at Boston University School of Theology is named after the Reverend Dr. Shaw, and that Women's Center served as the northeastern jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church as the Women's Center. And she was honored in memory with the Howard Shaw Junior High School, built in 1922 in southwest Schuylkill County. However, Shaw and her fellow suffragists were often deeply divided on the tactics that were needed to pursue their goal, and most profoundly on the matters of race. For example, before Anna became the president in March 3, 1913, they organized a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, which is considered the first national suffrage parade. And that parade took place the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated, and it included 5,000 marchers, bands, mounted brigades, and floats. But here's where we meet another woman baptized a Methodist, Ida B. Wells. She was a pioneering black journalist, anti-lynching activist, and suffragist. However, fellow suffragists that day asked that Sister Ida, one of the most seasoned veterans in the fight, not to walk alongside them, but rather at the rear of the parade, because the Women's Suffrage Association feared retribution from the Southern white supporters. But then, as you might know, the mob overtook the parade route, and they began for hours to severely beat the women, and Wells rejoined her fellow suffragists at the front of the fray. But that wasn't the only violence suffragists would endure. They had to face mob attacks constantly. They were arrested for their civil disobedience, and they endured brutality in prison we can hardly imagine today, including force feeding when they dared go on hunger strikes. In 1917, they organized White House pickets, and they were called Silent Sentinels. And more than 500 women were arrested, many sent to workhouses in Virginia. And in October, Alice Paul, now the head, was sentenced to 7 months in prison for picketing. And during her sentence, she was placed in solitary confinement. But it all rose to a head on November 14th, what's called the Night of Terror, when those jailed picketers, those silent sentinels, were beaten, severely tortured, and chained, and then finally released weeks later. But that's when everything changed. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson declared support for the women's suffrage and urged the Senate, saying, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering, sacrifice, and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" Finally, it came down to a vote. Tennessee. There were 36 states' approval needed, and they had 35. And on August 18, 1820, the state of Tennessee met in Nashville, and the legislature there faced an overflowing crowd in the gallery, and they knew that only 47 of the 96 legislators present were in their cause. And they had little hope that the youngest legislator at 24, Harry Byrne, would join their ranks, because they spied in his lapel a red rose, which meant opposition to the women's vote. A yellow rose meant they were sympathetic. But what they could not see was that he had a letter from his Methodist mother, Phoebe Byrne, written in July, saying, "Dear son, hoorah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt." And her son's sudden eye won the vote. But as we can imagine, immediately after that surprise vote, the young legislator faced heated accusations that his vote was brought by bribery. And he replied, "I want to state that I changed my vote in favor of ratification, first because I believe in full suffrage as a right. I believe we had a moral and legal right to ratify. And I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow." Amen. So it passed, and then Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, on August 26, 1920, signed the law into Constitution. However, many Black, Native American, Hispanic, and Asian American women still were denied access to the ballot box. And Methodist women such as Mary McLeod Bethune continued the fight for the rights of racial injustice. And those women of color were not able to vote until the Voting Rights Act was signed in 1965. So may we honor their sacrifice by getting out and voting and